going to happen. In 1995, when the United States Congress started working on what became the DC School Reform Act of 1995, which was actually became law in 1996, the public education in the district was in a state of crisis. And I'm not using crisis in the way we use it today, like I have a hangnail or something like that. I'm using it in the initial sense of the word. The DC public school system, which I'm sure some of you think is still not very good, was a disaster. By that I mean they could not get their schools open on opening day on a regular basis. One year they opened 3 weeks late because they hadn't complied with a fire ruling. They didn't distribute their textbooks on time or at all. The test scores were even more abysmal than they are now. There was a complete crisis. And the Republicans were in control of Congress, and at that time they, as most of you know, they actually took over the District of Columbia. And they put in something here to run the government called the Financial Control Board, because the government was about, as I recall, about $800 million in the red. So the government wasn't working, the schools weren't working, the school buildings were completely falling apart. There was no plan to fix any of this stuff. So the Congress took over the city, and as part of that, soon after that, they passed the School Reform Act. And you have to remember that this act was passed by a Republican Congress. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. And their views of public education were that the problem was the central school system, that centralized school systems really didn't work to bring good education to children. And they wanted something different. They wanted something completely different. And charter schools had started up in Minnesota in 1991, just a few years before this. And that's what they wanted. And they wanted the charter schools to be independent. They wanted them to have freedom of action, each individual school, and they wanted them to be free from the kind of regulatory burdens that schools in school systems are subject to. And any of you who, as I did, ran a school or was in the school administration in the public schools knows what that regulatory burden is all about. So in the view of the Congress, all of these things that keep school systems from being able to improve were not supposed to apply to the charter schools. And so they passed this law, which was designed to keep the charter schools as far as possible from the DC government and from the DC school system. So, that's the context. It's very important. It's very important to understand that as we start to talk about the, what we're dealing with now. And so I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk about the legal framework.
Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the themes that I hope will come through today is picking up on Robert's point about what Congress had in mind to give charter schools autonomy and freedom from kind of the weight of bureaucracy and rules, is that as the charter school movement has kind of matured here in the district, I think what you're going to see is that in some ways there's a kind of encroachment on those values through the, I would say, good intentions, but nevertheless very much contrary to the legislative intent and spirit of the School Reform Act, specifically with respect to kind of rules, bureaucracy, and autonomy. And that's a theme that's going to sort of really be woven through everything that we talk about. First, a little bit of a slog through the law, just to give you a feel for something that may not be clear just as you're doing your day-to-day jobs, which is that when Congress passed the School Reform Act, it actually built into it some very strong provisions that give charter schools the freedom to run their own show. So There are a couple of key provisions. One is that under the School Reform Act gives charter schools autonomy in these four areas: expenditures, administration, personnel, and instructional methods. And the statute specifically says that charter schools shall exercise exclusive control in those areas. So it's pretty powerful. And each of those words is freighted with a lot of meaning. So expenditures gives charter schools the freedom to make decisions about budgets. There's an exception, though, as you probably all know, particularly the financial folks, which is that there are procurement rules that require that if you're going to spend more than $25,000 on some kind of service or good, you've got to go through a procurement process. But essentially, you've got freedom over expenditures. Administration is the next. Broad powers for charter schools to set policies for its board, for its teachers, for students. Personnel, the third area. Exclusive control over things like hiring, compensation, training, performance, termination. And then the fourth area of autonomy is instructional methods, curriculum, teaching methods. So that's a really broad package of freedom that Congress intended charter schools to have. Second piece of the School Reform Act that's important in terms of autonomy is that it specifically says in the statute that any policy set for DCPS do not apply to charter schools. And Robert's going to get into that when he talks about some of the legislative encroachments. But there really is an intent to separate out charter schools from the kinds of rules that govern DCPS. And then finally, just as a kind of catch-all, there's a provision that was enacted several years after the School Reform Act came into force, which basically says that no law shall have any application to charter schools relating to the establishment, administration, or operation of charter schools to the extent that it conflicts with the School Reform Act. And so what you've got is you've got these three mechanisms that Congress has woven into the School Reform Act, all of which are designed to achieve the goals that Robert talked about. And again, when you go actually into the legislative history, there's some wonderful language, and I'm just going to mention a few things just because I don't want you to think about what Congress had in mind as we look at ways in which some of those sort of values and policies are being eroded. So, there's language in the legislative history of the School Reform Act that says that charter schools should not be managed by a government bureaucracy. There's language that says that charter schools should encourage innovation, and they should be free from burdensome rules and regulations that frustrate so many good teachers. I'm reading from what Congress wrote. Another phrase that's helpful is that charter schools are to be held accountable for results, but, quote, how the charter schools achieve those results is left to the creative judgment of those who found and run schools. That's what Congress had in mind. There are some limitations in the School Reform Act on charter school autonomy that I'll just mention briefly. One is that you're subject to health and safety laws and age discrimination laws, as you would expect, and other civil rights discrimination statutes, age discrimination, and so on. But that essentially is the legislative framework that Congress set up. The last quote that I wrote talked about accountability, and this is where kind of the tension kind of emerges between this emphasis on autonomy and at the same time sort of the growth of some regulation over charter schools. And that is certainly through what I deal mostly with is the Public Charter School Board, ways in which the charter board holds schools accountable as it's required to do, but in doing so encroaches on charter schools' autonomy. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the authority that the Public Charter School Board has to lay the foundation for this tension between autonomy and accountability. Actually, before I do that, you're going to talk about other aspects of the legislation.
I want to mention some other things in the School Reform Act, some other provisions of the School Reform Act to give you an idea about how different Congress's conception of charter schools was than what we actually have now, which we're going to talk about later. The first is that the Congress defined what a charter was in the law. And there are only 6 or 7 items. And they don't include the things over which you have exclusive control. Why is that? But here's why that's important. As you know, when you sign a contract with the Public Charter School Board to run a charter school, the Public Charter School Board, in that contract, the entire application you filed is incorporated by reference into the charter. And that's important because the Public Charter School Board's authority under the School Reform Act to monitor you comes out of the charter only. So, basically the Congress was saying, we're giving these areas of exclusive control to the schools, and neither the government nor the Public Charter School Board has anything to do with them, right? So I don't want to get into the specifics, but I'm sure you're all thinking about things that go against this. The other thing is that the Congress didn't see you doing a lot of reports. They put in the law that you have to do an annual report. That's the only report that is mentioned in the law. And just to show you how different their concept was, their annual report, the annual report language requires your school to submit your standardized test scores to the Public Charter School Board. So, you're actually much more operating as a private school. Obviously, you can't discriminate and all that, but in the Congress's view, you're operating as a private school. You have to take this test, and then when you get the results back, you have to report it to the PCSB. That's part of your function. They would never have countenanced the idea that OSSI is in charge of all this stuff, and then they send you your test scores, and then they send them to the PCSB first, and all this kind of stuff. That just goes completely against what the Congress had in mind. Okay, so that's what happened in 1995. There are a couple other laws that I want to mention. The big one is the Education Reform Act of 2007. For those of you who weren't here in 2007, that law was the mayoral takeover law, the takeover of DCPS. But it did other things. It created this monster known as OSSI. Prior to OSSI, beginning in 2000, we had something called a state education office. The state education office was small, relatively efficient, and didn't see itself at all as a regulatory body. What they did is they looked at the funding formula every couple of years. They had a research capacity, a policy capacity. I don't recall a single regulation that came out of them because they really didn't have the authority to regulate. This creation of OSSI was a very big thing, and it turned this into a major bureaucracy. And most of the people who were the federal funds function was still in DCPS after they created OSSI, after they created the SEO. Finally, the federal funds function went over to OSSI, but so did almost everybody who worked in the state education agency prior to that, which was in DCPS. So 200 or 300 DCPS people went over and became part of OSSI. And that inevitably set the tone for what OSSI was all about. They also created the State Board of Education. And it's very interesting. OSSI isn't given any regulatory authority in this section of the Education Reform Act of 2007 that creates OSSI, but in the State Board of Ed part, it gives the State Board of Ed the power to advise OSSI on state policies, including those governing charter schools, and to advise OSSI on state regulations proposed by OSSI or the mayor. So as you heard from Stephen, none of these regulations or laws that are passed or promulgated that apply to both DCPS and charter schools by their terms, none of them apply to charter schools. None of them. However, this bill created this mindset in Aussie, and not just in Aussie, in the council too, that that Aussie was primarily a regulatory body, not thought leadership, not anything, primarily a regulatory body. And so I would say that the position of the government right now on this is that the Education Reform Act of 2007 amends or supersedes the School Reform Act by implication, right? So they don't, the creation of Aussie and the State Board of Ed in 2007, the mayoral takeover, caused everyone in officialdom to start thinking differently about the public charter schools and their place in overall public education. They started talking about the state. The state. Okay. So there have been an endless stream of other bills, some of which we've informed you about and some of which we haven't. We had the Pre-K Act, which passed in 2010, I think, and this has created an endless stream of battles for all of us. There's a Healthy Schools Act, all this truancy regulation, special ed funding, which Gray did at the beginning, which for the first time ever put limitations on how schools could spend local dollars, which is completely antithetical to the notion that you have exclusive control over your expenditures. So there's a lot out there, and theoretically none of it applies, but in reality, it's the kind of thing that we and you are dealing with all the time.
Okay. One thing, if you have questions, you should feel free to interrupt and raise your questions so that we can, I think a more interactive session will make it interesting for everybody. So let me just pause for a second and ask, does anybody have any question or comment about anything that we've talked about so far?
I know this topic has come up before, but I still, to some degree, feel caught between the graduation requirements that are set forth by the State Board of Education and whether we have to adhere to those.
Well, I would say no under the School Reform Act. What happened with graduation requirements is prior to Scott Pearson taking over the PCSB, whatever kind of requirement was passed by the State Board of Ed, the PCSB immediately notified the charter schools that they would have to begin following it, which was totally wrong. And we used to argue with Josephine Baker about this all the time. I would say that, if you got Scott in a quiet corner, he'd say that they don't apply to you either. However, the question is, we're going to talk about this later when we get to the strategies part of the discussion. The question is, who's going to stand up? Who's going to ignore these requirements? Are there any other questions? Any questions from people who are remote?
No. Okay. Oh, question.
Can I ask? I know you referenced that part of the '95 Act that specifically exempts charters from any law passed by mayor and council or state. One of the things in there is the State Board of Education, or something. I forget what the exact wording is, but I know that the Board of Education has changed and it was dissolved and reconstituted as something else in between when the law was passed and today. And how does that play into what we are and aren't required to follow?
That's the PIRA statute, isn't it?
Right. So there's a question about the impact of the dissolution of the old DCPS Board of Education and the creation of the new State Board of Education. What is the impact of that move on the kind of freedoms that we've been talking about? Is that right?
Yeah, and particularly the '95 School Reform Act specifically exempts charters from the decisions of the Board of Education, but when it was doing it, it foresaw that, I guess, the DCPS Board of Education
Right.
is what it used to be, as opposed to the State Board of Education.
Well,
Is that-
it also the School Reform Act also exempts charter schools. So in the definition of DC government, which is put in the School Reform Act, there's a detailed definition of DC government and all of its instrumentalities, as they're called. Charter schools are specifically accepted from the definition. So charter schools are not part of the DC government. The State Board of Education is part of the DC government. OSSI is part of the DC government. It actually goes farther than that. OSSI and DCPS and the mayor are all the same thing since 2007. That, OSSI can pretend that it's a state and all that, and DCPS can pretend that it's autonomous, but the mayor has control over all of it. The mayor appoints the head of OSSI. The mayor appoints the chancellor. So the dissolution of the old Board of Education really had no implications for the charter schools, except that the old Board of Education had the authority to charter schools, just like the PCSB. And they chartered a bunch of schools, and obviously after they were out of business, everything went over to the PCSB. So that upset a number of people, especially the leaders of the schools that had been chartered by the Board of Ed, but it had no implications for this discussion. Any other questions or comments?
Okay, so we talk about this, the tension between charter school autonomy and accountability and how it gets played out, in particular through the Public Charter School Board. I'll first just walk you through kind of the relatively limited powers that the Public Charter School Board has, and then I'm going to show you how Public Charter School Board uses those powers in a way that actually encroaches on charter school freedom. So the powers include, was there a question? Was that just a mid-morning stretch? Sorry.
Come on, William.
Charter School Board has the right to monitor the operations of charter schools. They have to make sure that charter schools comply with applicable laws. They have to monitor the progress of schools in meeting their students' academic achievement expectations that are specified in the school charter. They've got to make sure that charter schools fulfill their annual reporting requirements. And then they have rights with respect to the review, renewal, and revocation of charters. So in a very broad, general sense, those are their powers.
Would you say this one more time, Stephen? Just say that.
Sure. So let me go through it again. Sorry. They monitor charter school operations. They make sure that charter schools comply with applicable laws. They monitor the progress of schools in meeting their student achievement, academic achievement expectation specified in the charter. They make sure that charter schools comply with their annual reporting requirements. And then they have rights with respect to reviewing charters every 5 years, renewing charters after 15 years, and revoking charters if the charter school hasn't met certain requirements. And I'll just briefly touch on those. As far as renewal of a charter, charter board must renew a charter after 15 years unless the school has committed a material violation of law or failed to meet its goals and academic achievement expectations. Those are the only two grounds on which, at least the School Reform Act, permits the charter board not to renew a school's charter. The charter board can also revoke a charter at any time if the charter school violates the law, fails to meet its goals, or engages in fiscal mismanagement. And then the last power that it has, the charter board has, it doesn't use it much, but I think it sort of keeps it in the background, is it has the power to compel the charter school to produce books and records that pertain to any aspect of what the charter school does. So those are the powers. Now let's look at least through the experience that I've had in representing charter schools, ways in which the charter board uses those powers, I think with good intentions, which is to hold charter schools accountable but at a cost, and the cost is encroaching on charter school autonomy. First example I want to talk about, and I would be delighted if any of you, as I go through this, have had experiences along these lines. If you could share the experiences, that would be really helpful and interesting. So the first area has to do with charter renewal. And I think there's several ways in which the charter board has overstepped its powers when it comes to charter renewal. The first thing is that it's not at all unusual when the charter board renews a school's charter to attach conditions. An example would be, we're going to renew your charter, but with respect to kind of campus A, unless you hit a PMF of 40, next year, we're going to close that campus. Very typical. There are two problems with that. First of all, the charter board has no authority to impose conditions, 0. And second of all, it has no authority to close a specific campus. Now you could say, well, sure, but then their option would be to close the entire, LEA. But the fact is, as a legal matter, there's no authority in the School Reform Act to either impose conditions or to segment charter schools' campuses and direct that one of those campuses be closed. So that's the first way. Just through the conditioning of the renewal of a school's charter, the charter board can overstep its bounds. And it's very difficult for schools who are in that position because inevitably when you see the draft report, you look at the conditions and you want to try and negotiate with the charter board to lift those conditions. But the charter board can say, look, if you don't agree with these conditions, then we're just not going to renew your charter, and that will close the school. So they have great power with respect to non-renewal, which they can use kind of indirectly to pressure charter schools essentially to have to comply with conditions for which there's no authority in the statute. A second way to charter board in the renewal process, and I think this is actually personally sort of more insidious, is if you look at the charter renewal guidelines, there's a part 1 and a part 2. Part 1 has to do with your application with respect to charter renewal. Part 2, which is nowhere mentioned in the renewal requirements for charter schools, has to do with what happens after the charter board decides to renew your charter. What you're expected to do under the guidelines is you're supposed to have a meeting with the charter board at which you're going to talk about your plans for the next 15 years and revise your goals. Well, there's no obligation to revise your goals. If you're happy with your goals, the School Reform Act allows you to continue. As long as you're achieving those goals, you can continue to hold on to those goals. The charter board is insisting that schools do, after they get the charter renewed by the charter board, is to meet and to encourage schools to rethink their goals. Additionally, and we'll talk about the PMF, a lot of schools find themselves in the situation when they've just had their charter renewed of being strongly encouraged by the charter board to adopt the PMF as a statement of its goals.
They're not only strongly encouraging it, they have a sort of memo template that they give to you. It's like, here's a sort of
Make it easy.
globally, put your name in here and return it to us, and we'll have it. We'll take it up at whatever set meeting. So we're looking at that. We are not adopting the PMF for a variety of reasons, including the fact that they seem to be wanting to strong arm everybody to that, and it has serious flaws that only social scientists really understand. Wicked smart people, and the fact that, yeah, they're kind of using the voice to get a lot of people to adopt it. And I think that some folks have, for better or worse, like, but not maybe fully understanding the implications, and that's only molding them to try to push more schools to try to do that.
I think it's and for those who are on the webinar, there's just kind of a comment that there's a lot of pressure being put on charter schools to adopt the PMF as goals. There are flaws, and what is your school?
Center City.
Center City. Okay.
Let me. We have a question from somebody outside of this room. We have two questions. One is who oversees the Public Charter School Board, and then a more detailed question: who oversees PCSB? How do they impose these conditions without oversight? So, in the School Reform Act, it says that the Public Charter School Board is created within the DC government. is created with the DC government. This is extremely vague language. And to the extent possible, the Public Charter School Board tries to operate outside of the DC government, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So it's very interesting because you have the School Reform Act, which creates the authorizer within the DC government, but the schools that are authorized are not within the DC government, right? So the best way to think about the Public Charter School Board is a quasi-governmental entity. In the School Reform Act, it says that annually they have to file a report that goes to the mayor, the Congress, and the Secretary of Education. As a practical matter, they're under constant pressure from the DC government to cooperate, in quotes. They have to, they have to justify themselves at budget time. One of the reasons the PCSB, I know you all hated the PCSB raising its, the amount it can charge you, but one of the main reasons they did that was so that they wouldn't be taking government money directly from the government. Prior to that, they take millions every year from the government, and if they take money from the government, they're subject to more oversight. So, in terms of the conversation we're having here, I would say that no one is overseeing the PCSB when they're providing too much accountability. When the PCSB gets in trouble is when the rest of the government thinks they're not holding the schools accountable. And believe me, there are a lot of people out there who think, or at least they say, that the PCSB is not holding charter schools accountable, which is the opposite of your experience. So it's a conundrum, really. And so when we talk about strategies, I mean, the strategies for the charter schools about the PCSB and other things involve creating political pressure on the Public Charter School Board.
Just moving from the PMF, schools that decide not to adopt the PMF as a statement of charter of schools can then find themselves under the following pressure. Okay, you've got a goal that it's really not easily measured by any kind of metrics. So what we are going to do, we the Public Charter School Board, we're going to engage in a conversation with you. You don't want the PMF? Okay. We're going to come up with sort of an alternative, some form of metrics against which we can assess you. So if you have an arts-based component to your mission and you want your students to be conversant in certain areas, then the charter board, in a weird sort of way, will try and encourage the school to put metrics around how you measure whether you've attained the goal of civic-minded students. And it's very much a product of this sort of a metrics mindset that the charter board has. Again, I think the motives are to improve performance, but it comes at some cost. I think it comes at great cost. I've also seen situations in which the charter school is reluctant to go down this road, and it's taking time to negotiate. And all of a sudden, a quarterly payment is due. And it has happened that the charter board has threatened to withhold the quarterly payment until such time as the school signs a new charter agreement with goals approved by the charter board. And the reason why that's a real legal issue is that, as Robert was saying earlier, the charter agreement is not your charter. The charter board would sort of like you to believe that, but in fact, your charter is what the statute says is the charter, and those are a few key elements of your original petition. And when the charter board renews your charter, when it has that vote, your charter's been renewed. Your charter is not renewed when you sign a charter agreement. That's a contract. In the charter board's mind, it's the charter is only approved at such time as you sign the charter agreement. And so it has happened before that if there's an ongoing debate with the charter board about what should go in the agreement, and should you adopt the PMF, and if not, what would the metrics be, for them to say, look, you better sort of hurry up and get this done, because otherwise you're operating without a charter, and we're going to withhold the payment. Well, it's just not right, because the school has a charter, and it's been renewed when the vote was taken by the charter board. On charter agreements, another misconception Charter schools do not have an obligation to sign a charter agreement. There are good reasons why you might want to do it, but the fact of the matter is what you need to operate is a charter. So
let me just say that, I mean, I'm sure you're all thinking about the practical implications of what Stephen's saying. Stephen is telling you the truth, but you know, who's going to refuse to sign a charter and then have the PCSB say you're not a charter school anymore? Then you're going to have to go to court and all that. It would be nice if someone would do that. That would help a lot. Another problem with the charter school agreement is that NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, very early on, having a charter school agreement became one of their best practices. And Josephine Baker at one point was vice chair of NACSA, so she had quite a lot of influence on that. But how do you take on, when the entire country or every state, as far as I know, has a charter school agreement? How do you take it on? I think that, you just, for right now anyway, you just push back as hard as you can. And we'll talk more about pushing back later on.
I'll mention one other way in which the Public Charter School Board encroaches on autonomy, and then I'll hand it back to Robert, and that is through the enactment of policies. So under the School Reform Act, the Charter School Board has no authority to enact rules, regulations, none of that. Its powers are limited by the statute. We talked about what those powers are. Nevertheless, the Charter Board issues policies. I checked it this morning. There are 47 policies now that the Charter Board has on its website, which it has approved. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One, we talked before about in the legislative history to not be under kind of the burden of regulation. Well, what's happened is that just through the gradual accretion of these policies, charter schools are increasingly finding themselves under the weight of rules and regulations that make it difficult for the best charter schools with all the resources to comply. It's time consuming, it's challenging, they're complicated rules. So there's that burden. Secondly, if you violate one of those policies, it gives the Charter Board an opportunity to at least raise the question as to whether your charter status in some way is in jeopardy. So there could be a notice of a charter violation. And so I think there's been stepped up enforcement with respect to these various policies that put schools in a situation where, let's say, discipline. You find out that, the Charter Board doesn't like the fact that in order to maintain discipline, you're suspending kids, right? I mean, you want to maintain a good learning environment, and that's essential to your mission. And yet the Charter Board is concerned that somehow your numbers are not what they think they should be.
Can I ask a question? I'm not sure I'm seeing the difference between the charter and the charter agreement.
Sure.
Are you saying that the charter agreement is about the goals that maybe they want after? I mean, what we signed originally is the charter, and when it's renewed, they're trying to get us to do another charter agreement with different goals, and that.
Right. So
hold on 1 second. There's a question that Stephen's going to answer about the difference between a charter and a charter agreement.
Right. So when you apply for your charter, you have to prepare a petition. And there's probably, when that was, shall we say, how many years ago was your charter? You probably remember with acute detail all the things that went into that. It's a very demanding process. And there are components that go into the petition. The School Reform Act says, here are all the things, here are the 25 things you have to put in your petition. Goals and bylaws and a whole list of things. Governance procedures. The School Reform Act selects, I forget the number, 5 or 6 of those elements that go into your petition and say, that's your charter. That's your charter. And that's not so when the Charter Board votes to renew your charter, it allows you to continue. It's and that's different from a charter agreement, which comes, I'm not sure how they originally began. I think Robert mentioned best practices. The Charter Board conflates the two by suggesting that The charter agreement actually is the charter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we have, I'm not the founding head of school, but I've never seen anything that is just a small charter with those 5 or 6 things.
You wouldn't. It's just a creature. It's a creature of statute. So the statute says mission, goals, bylaws. I can't remember the other ones. It's kind of a legal construct, but that's actually what the charter board renews. Those elements when it renews your charter. The charter agreement is a more elaborate document with many other obligations. For example, if you're a multi-campus school, they would like you to include in your charter agreement a provision that says, gives them a power which they actually don't have, which is they can, if they don't like the performance of one of your campuses, they can close the campus, so that's closing down the whole charter school. So the charter agreement is a much more elaborate set of rules and obligations, which they ask you to sign after the board renews the charter, but it's different than the charter. And I raised it because there's no requirement, although I don't know of any school that doesn't have a charter agreement, but there's no actual requirement that you sign on.
Let me butt in here for a minute. I'm going to answer. We have a question which I'm going to answer in a minute. But on this, I've been intimately involved for 4 years now in getting the charter school agreement changed so that it, getting rid of some of the most onerous requirements in there. And so I went through one process when Brian Jones was the head of the charter school board and Josephine Baker was still in, and we drafted, with Stephen's help, we drafted a model charter school agreement. We decided that we really weren't going to be able to get rid of the charter school agreement altogether. So we drafted a model, and we actually used quite a number of the things from the NACSA best practices because the public charter school board was not following the NACSA best practices. The NACSA best practices said that in your agreement, the autonomy of the charter school should be fully acknowledged in the agreement itself and some other provisions, which I think those of you who renewed lately, there is something in there by that. So we got some taken out. And then when Scott Pearson came in, there was new administration, and especially after he hired Nicole Streeter to be his in-house lawyer, we went through another round of this because, I meet with Nicole weekly to talk about this kind of stuff and propose policies. So all the policies that come out of the PCSB now that you see, they were 12 times worse before. And so the PCSB, and this kind of gets into the question, when faced with a challenge to their authority, how does PCSB respond? Do they interpret the law differently? So since Scott Pearson has come in, we've been able, and I say we, I mean we focus, we've been able to, we have extremely good access to him, to Naomi DeVoe, and to Nicole Streeter. And so we're able to constantly push back on things that they think they want to do. So for example, they do not put out any policies for public comment until they've shown me drafts. And so I tell them, you can't do this under school reform, you can't do that. And it's been a big surprise to me, but they make a lot of changes. They're still not good in many cases, but they make a lot of changes. And also, I have a regular breakfast with Scott Pearson, and he tries out stuff on me that he wants to do. And I'm constantly telling him, you can't do that. And I push on him really hard, and surprisingly, he keeps having breakfast with me. So I give him a lot of credit. And it's hard for you to understand this. I'm really not trying to defend Scott Pearson or the PCSB, but I've been doing this for 16 years. And the first 13, we couldn't talk to anyone at the PCSB. They were not interested in hearing from advocates. So it's a big change. But on the fundamental notion of the charter school agreement, they disagree. It's not that they interpret the law differently on that one, but it's just that they're going to keep doing it until somebody makes them stop doing it. But the agreement is significantly better than it used to be, for what that's worth. Scott and I frequently disagree on the nature and extent of accountability. Sometimes I win that, and sometimes I don't. Um, so, you know, part of what goes on with the PCSB is that the PCSB is getting pressure from the government all the time. And what's worse, the PCSB, I should just say Scott, is very afraid that if the PCSB, can't show the government that it's really working hard on accountability, the government is going to do something worse. Okay, so I accept that as a premise, but of course you still have to push back, and a lot of times I say, well, fine, let the government do it. You're not, we shouldn't be doing this in our own movement. If the government does it, we'll deal with the government. But as an authorizer, their perspective is bound to be different from our perspective, and sometimes we do disagree on the implications of the School Reform Act. When it comes to OSSI, are we ready to move into that now? When it comes to the tensions with OSSI and with the DC government, the PCSB really has your back. So for the first time ever, the PCSB and Focus are on the same page on virtually 100% of everything that OSSI tries to do to you or the council tries to do to you. And so what we do is we work out a strategy about who's going to say what to whom and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a real advantage there. And as you know, OSSI is a huge problem. I don't have to go into much because you experience all this. Remember, I said at the beginning that you're supposed to be free from excessive reporting, and you're not supposed to have people telling you how to run your school. But OSSI, over the years, ever since 2007, we've had a steady stream of regulations. Some of those we've defeated. Some of you may not know that several years ago they came out with 82 pages of pre-K regulations that were supposed to apply to your schools, including how often you had to change kids' diapers and all this other stuff that just doesn't, it just doesn't apply to you. We were able to stop that and a couple of other ones, but there have been, they came out with proposed discipline regulations. You guys remember those? Discipline regulations where we went round and round with them for 2 years. And they had a little hearing, and Scott said to them in this hearing, you can pass these regulations, but I'm not going to enforce them. So OSSI is always looking for carte blanche. They had this data bill that recently that we were able to get fixed to a certain extent, where they basically gave them the authority to collect all the data from you that they wanted anytime they wanted without regard to any legal authority. Yes, question.
So from my understanding, OSSI was formed in large part because we had no federal pass-through entity in DC before it was formed. Like every other state had an SEA, so that all of the title funds and all of the federal funds could go through the SEA to the subrecipient. And where we run into a lot of confusion and duplicate reporting is with our federal funding. So, OSSI has the responsibility from the federal level to monitor its subrecipients, but PCSB also has the duty and the authority to monitor our compliance with laws. So, we get document requests all the time from OSSI for, demonstrate your Title I compliance, and then we also have to submit similar documentation or different documentation to PCSB. So, you get kind of caught between, is it worth the effort to push back on OSSI or push back on PCSB, or do we just submit everywhere?
Right. This is a question about duplicate document requests, et cetera, from OSSI and PCSB in the area that involves federal funds and Title I. We've always had an SEA ever since the Fed required that you have an SEA, but the SEA, remember that before there were charter schools, DCPS was the only game in town, and DCPS was both the LEA and the SEA. And it was only in 2007 that our request began in 1998 to get the SEA out of DCPS, it was only in 2007 that became a reality. Since then, the problem is as you've identified, and both OSSI and the PCSB have regularly promised that they're going to work together on this as they're supposed to work together, so that you don't have duplicate requests. I don't know how to advise you about how to deal with duplicate requests, because obviously OSSI and the PCSB aren't doing nearly as good a job as they should on it. Okay.
Just that I'll call the two people who asked for the same thing, and I say I'm doing one of these, talk to each other, and you pick, and then I'll submit. And that's
Right.
And that happens on a number of fronts. That just happened with like the info stuff, and they're like, hey, if you want to get backpacks, do it. I'm like, well, you talk to people who do these, and then you tell me what we need to do, but I'm not sending you a list of our homeless students this year. Because you already have it. And that's pretty effective. The trick is figuring out who the two people are.
Right.
And PCSB is great about it. And I think on the Title I stuff, Emma McMahon has been really, like, if I call and I say, hey, there's an assurance in here that says I have to give something to OSSI, and I'm only supposed to give it to you, then she calls OSSI and Scott and Naomi handle it. In those conflicts, I think it tends to be OSSI who's not the bad actor. They're just so big, they don't know what they're doing. And they're not good at talking to each other. But I think that PCSB has been relatively effective at having those conversations so that I don't have to.
What for those of you who are remote, Irene Holtzman of KIP just suggested that everyone do what she does, which I think is an excellent idea. If you get a request from OSSI and PCSB for the same thing, you call each of the two people up and you say, okay, you guys decide which one of you needs this, and I'll send it to you, but I'm not sending it to both. And that, when we talk in a few minutes about strategies, this is an excellent strategy. You would, those of you who just do what OSSI and the PCSB want should be aware that we have a number of schools. It's not a big number as far as I know, but we do have a number of schools that are constantly saying no to both of these entities. No, I won't give you this. No, I won't give you that. Or as Irene says, I'll only give it to one person. You guys figure it out. And Irene also said that the PCSB is very good about this. OSSI maybe not so good because they're big and the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. Is there another comment or question here?
I would only add to the comment that it's better to do that in the direction of PCSB, because often enough, the person that you find at OSSI that's in charge of something is gone 6 months later. And when they finally get around to hiring a replacement, they usually do not know what their job entails and are very confused by it.
Okay, so we've only got about 25 minutes left, so I want to push through this. So we're talking about the tension between autonomy and accountability. We've talked a lot about OSSI. I don't think we need to beat that horse to death, except there is a lot of stuff pending. They have OSSI still trying to get all the preschools to use the QRIS, and they're still trying to get the schools to administer the kindergarten entrance exam, KEA, or whatever it's called. So OSSI, and they're regularly, because they see themselves as primarily a regulatory, not a leadership agency, sadly, they're going to be constantly doing this. It's never going to end. When it comes to the DC Council, I think I can safely say that on the council there's little or no respect for charter school autonomy. Autonomy goes against one of the basic tenets of the government, as I see it, which is if we give you money, you need to tell us, you need to do what we tell you. And also the government, the people on the council, they get ideas and they love their own ideas. And they translate these ideas into bills without talking to anyone beforehand who has anything to do with the charter schools. They don't read the School Reform Act. They don't know the School Reform Act. If they knew the School Reform Act, they wouldn't like it. Okay, you have to understand this is fundamental. And Michael Musante is standing back there, spends a huge amount of time down there trying to educate people to this thing, and they really don't care. So if and these things have actually happened. You haven't seen these bills, but because we've been able to stop them. But Council Member Orange decides that no one's teaching reading properly, so he introduces a bill that says from now on you all have to use the same reading program, and he specifies the program. There was a bill, not quite a while ago, that would have put every kid in the District of Columbia into school uniforms. The truancy legislation that you're already dealing with, Healthy Schools Act, none of these things really apply to you at all. So they're the ones you know about. There are a whole bunch you don't know about. But you just have to know that there's a huge tension. And even among those council members who support, uniform funding, say, or think you should get more school buildings, when it comes to autonomy, the relationship tends to break down. They just don't like it. And then you have other agencies trying to get their act in. You know about the language access regulations. I wrote all of you, at least all the people on the charter leaders list, got information about that, where they want to treat you as a government agency for the purpose of the Language Access Act, which means you would, be giving up control over personnel, and you'd be giving up control over a lot of things, how you spend your money, in order to comply with an act that clearly only is intended to apply to a government agency, which you are not. Then some of you will remember that the DC auditor wanted to audit some of your schools. And, we wrote to you regularly about that, and so did the PCSB. Like, don't give them this stuff. They don't have any authority, and it's for the same reason. All right, can we go on? Are there any more questions out there? No.
Strategies?
Yeah, why don't we go on to what the future holds very briefly. As I said earlier, or maybe I didn't say it, but I've been in this job since 1998. And a couple times, it's always been a bad job, but a couple times I was really afraid for the charter school movement. And that was, I don't know how long ago this was, maybe 7 or 8 years, but there were a lot of calls for charter school, a moratorium on chartering. We already have too many charter schools. That was when we had a lot fewer charter schools. That happened a couple of times, and it got very serious. I remember when Vincent Gray took over as chair of the council, he said that from the dais, maybe it's time, to have a moratorium, because, the usual suspects would go in and testify to all these horrible things that charter schools were doing. And, for several years, we had to fight off this group of about 12 rabid anti-charter school people who called themselves Save Our Schools, and they would go down to the council and testify. I'm not kidding. They would testify that you shouldn't give charter schools any buildings because they're part of the gentrification movement, and as soon as you give them the buildings, they're going to turn around and sell it to developers. Okay, and they made all kinds of other outrageous claims. They sued Two Rivers before Two Rivers got open. They sued them, saying they were violating the civil rights laws, and they were going to discriminate. They were really worried about getting a white charter school on Capitol Hill because of how it might affect the cluster schools, so-called, on Capitol Hill. They were worried about people leaving for Two Rivers. Well, I'm every bit as worried now as I was then, and probably more, because now we have 45% of the students, and the conversations, and this came out in the whole boundary, the boundary redo process that they just kind of finished. If you look at all the drafts of those things, the most outrageous things were, in the original drafts. And what we end up with in the final draft, let me give you an example. This was originally supposed to just be about DCPS boundaries, but the powers that be and the people who defend them in the public saw it as a way to, to deal with the charter school problem as well. And what they said was, we can't really do DCPS boundaries if we don't talk about the charter schools and the charter schools' effect on DCPS boundaries. So, they were saying that even in one of the drafts of this report, not in the final draft, they said, look, competition with charters actually hurts DCPS. And Kaya Henderson reaffirmed this in public testimony where she said, charter school will open up close to one of our struggling schools and everybody leaves the struggling school, or a lot of people leave the struggling school for the charter school, and therefore the school loses money. The DCPS school loses money, and therefore it makes it impossible for us to improve that school. Okay, so what do we get in the final draft? That decisions on opening charter schools, closing charter schools, allowing them to expand, allowing them to move, should be joint decisions between DCPS and the Public Charter School Board under the auspices of the Deputy Mayor for Education. Do you think any more charter schools will move or open if that happens? Because where are you going to go in this town where there isn't a struggling DCPS school within, shouting distance? So there's another recommendation here that I think I wanted to mention. Yeah, so the DME is ordered, and the mayor accepted this report. So that, I don't know, all of this stuff could be out the window for a while, but the stuff about the charter schools is not going away. It's going to get worse. So another committee is supposed to be set up by the DME in December to discuss needed structures for increased accountability and transparent decision-making on student assignment and mobility and capital investments. So what they want is they also blame charter schools because charter schools have different policies about when they'll take students and at what grade levels, and different suspension policies and different expulsion policies. And they want all that to be the same for all schools. And some of the people who attended these meetings, and this got translated into a document that Abigail Smith put out as part of this process, they were saying things like, it doesn't make sense anymore that now the charter schools have 45% of the students. It doesn't make sense anymore that there should be different length school years or school days. It doesn't make sense anymore that we should have different curricula. Now, some of the people who are part of this group were the main people in Save Our Schools, right? So now what's happening? People are afraid that DCPS is going to go away because of competition from charters, or it's going to shrink back to Ward 3 and parts of a couple of other wards. And, they're going to do everything and anything they can to prevent this from happening. And the best way to prevent it from happening is to eliminate or reduce competition from charter schools, not giving you buildings and and taking away some of the things that make you different and in many cases better. So this discussion about your autonomy this is why we're having it now. I mean, there's an argument for having it like twice a week since 1996, but we're having it now because things look like they're going to really heat up again. And that's why we wanted to talk about some strategies, and we want to get your engagement on this heavily. And we'll be having to talk about it more as a movement as we go down the road, because we're going to need to do something. And probably very soon. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. Oh, question.
So what about key pieces of federal guidance that directly apply to LEAs, like the LEA memo, maintenance of effort, or IDA, that directly apply to us and OSCE may or may not interpret properly?
Uh-huh.
Do we just go with what the federal guidance and interpret it and comply with it, or or even like restraint and seclusion, the guidance that just came out and that directly applies to LEAs? How do we handle that?
Well, there's a question here about how you handle things that involve federal funds, including IDEA. Do you go just on the basis of what the federal laws or guidance say, or do you also do what OSSI says you should do, which an individual school may think goes too far? So when it comes to IDEA and other federally funded programs, it gets murky. OSSI obviously has authority, and they also have authority to interpret what the Fed says. Our view is they don't have any authority to go beyond what the Fed says, unless the Fed in the regulation or whatever it is says they should do so. That they have the authority to expand or expound upon these rules. I think the best thing to do when you're faced with something like this is to let us know. And there are different ways to do that. One, you can call me, and people like Martha and Russ and some others here call us all the time, call me or Michael. And then we start to try to figure out what's going on. The other thing is the charter leader listserv. And very few charter leaders use this listserv, although anybody on the listserv can post to the listserv. And I think that as one strategy going forward, it would be a very good idea if you start to use this in the following way. You get a request from OSSI or PCSB or whatever it is that doesn't look right to you. You can just ask on the listserv, how are other people handling this? And of course, we see all of these too, so that would alert us that there's something going on. There needs to be a lot more conversation, between and among charter schools and between the charter schools and Focus, because we don't always find out about things. I mean, we find out about a lot of things just from you, and if you don't tell us, there could be 40 schools suffering unnecessarily, and we don't know about it. But let me just do one more thing here. That leads me to the first strategy. Might as well get the most radical strategy out on the table at the beginning, and that is don't take grants. Don't apply for grants. Every time and this doesn't apply to IDEA, because even if you're not a Title I school, you still have to do IDEA, right? But every time you take money from the government, you're giving up some of your autonomy, as I defined it at the beginning, because you're reducing your freedom of action, and you're increasing your burden of reporting, right? So, I think we only have one school, Roots, whose leader is sitting over here to my right, who does not take Title I money, even though she could get it. She also doesn't apply for any grants. Now, look, there's a lot you want to do in your schools. It requires money to do everything you want to do. But the question is it worth it? Is it worth it? And so every time something comes up, you need to ask yourself. We had a lot of schools that didn't take Race to the Top money because they didn't want to report on individual teacher evaluations and other things. And now, of course, OSSI's trying to get that information. Anyway, don't give it to them. Okay, just don't. But really, those schools were smart, but some of those same schools applied for other money. I mean, if I were running a school or starting a school right now, I would kill myself to try to figure out how I could run my school well without taking Title I funding. I mean, I know it's a lot of money. I'm sure I see a couple of people smiling. I get it. This is really radical, but think about what you're doing to yourselves. A lot of what you complain about, a lot of what bothers you the most has to do with OSSI and OSSI grants you take, including entitlement grants. I mean, what was that, Title II Part A, or what we went around with, where Martha realized she was getting $42,000 and she was being asked to do all this reporting. It's not
42,000 reports.
Right. It's not worth it. So that's my first idea. Go ahead, Stephen.
But you also have a period there where charter board was in fact sending schools messages saying you have not drawn down this money, and we're going to penalize you for not drawing down. Because if you look through some of the lists of money, if it's allocated on a per pupil basis, then it will list how much your school is due if you draw it down.
Mm-hmm.
And so schools were not drawing the money down. So the charter board started to send letters to them saying, you need to draw this money down. This is going to go against you.
When was that?
This was last year.
Okay, so Donald Hentz of Friendship just noted that the Public Charter School Board sent letters to schools that hadn't drawn down as much money from their, I guess, federal grants as were available to them, and saying or implying that this was going to be held against them if they didn't draw it down. I don't know anything about that. That could be true, but I do know that the Public Charter School Board, if you explain it to them, will accept you're not taking the grants in the first place. I just confirmed that this week. Russ?
I agree that you don't take the money if you don't have
Can you speak up?
Sorry, I agree. Don't take the money if you don't want the hassles. But I think OSSI is manageable. I think the PCSB is like the bigger problem right now in terms of they're in a self-created echo chamber where Dax and others are like, you're the best. And they're going, we're the best.
Right.
And like, we're super, like, and look at all the great things we're doing, and everyone should fall in line because everyone's telling us we're the best. And they kind of constantly get that, except for when they pull us together, like people like Irene and Alexandra and others are in a meeting, and they're like, you're doing this wrong, you're doing this wrong, and then they sort of stand there and they go, no, well, we have to do something. Like that was the rationale at a meeting around the PMF a few weeks ago.
Well, so Russ Williams of Center City says that the PCSB is a bigger problem than OSSI. Russ, do you have any suggestions for strategies for dealing with the PCSB?
Well, I mean, we're about to go through, like, we're supposed to update our goals, so we'll look at that really carefully. And I mean, I think if they try to voice an agreement or something beyond like the regular sort of process on this, that I mean, as an individual, we'll fight back and we'll be constant communication. I mean, it's sort of, I feel like they're encroaching in ways that like are getting very uncomfortable. And the whole, like the PMF is the best thing ever, and everybody needs to get into the PMF because boy, is it great. It's great for them. It's not great for LEAs. And certain LEAs are going to get tripped up. And the fact that they continue to raise the floors, they continue to move the bar, they're going like, and some of it, like they're jimmy rigging it behind the scenes and they're going, here, this is what it's going to look like this year. So you're adopting a moving target.
Yes.
You're
But
adopting the
you
PMF.
can opt out of it. I mean, you can opt out of that anytime you want, right?
Only insofar as like you would have goals, right? But they also have things that are associated with being a tier 3 school that are unrelated to your charter and unrelated to your charter goals, but do affect your charter renewal. And so I would say even if you opt out of it, you're not totally exempt from the implications of doing poorly on the PMF in terms of like saying, because KPC has no intention of ever adopting the PMF as our goals. Like that's not going to happen. Naomi and Scott know that. There's no amount of pressure that will make us do it. And we felt strongly about that from the beginning. But that being said, I would still be panicked if we were tier 3, because that leads to a whole bunch of other things, whether or not that's part of our charter, which is unfortunate. The other thing I just want to put on people's radar that I'm really, really uncomfortable with is the vast amounts of individual student level data that PCSB is collecting and then using for their own purposes that have nothing to do with accountability of individual private students. Like offhandedly, people at PCSB have said to me, oh no, we need to know exactly who the students are because we're doing X, Y, and Z type of research. And if you look at what happened in New York within Bloom, where the legislation passed in Louisiana, which masks the student identifiable data from the state itself, I think there's a really strong parent community that would be very wary of them connecting individual student attendance, discipline, and standardized test data in a way that for an entity whose job is to monitor the quality as a charter school, they have like literally no business doing it. And Scott 100% believes that they're entitled to know which students did what, as opposed to how the school did as a whole. And I have been I'm generally successful. I've been unsuccessful at not turning over student level data so far, but at some point I would love for like everyone to be like, no, we'll send you aggregate data, we'll send you de-identified data, but we're no longer sending you individual identifiable student data.
So, you know, Irene Holtzman was just discussing her discomfort with PCSB data requests that involve individual student data, and so she pushes back. KIPP is one of the schools that pushes back very hard on a lot of things. TMA is another. I don't know. I think there are a handful of others, but Irene says it would be great if everyone would push back. So, you know, that's a strategy that we need to develop as a movement now.
I just pick up on that. There's sort of I would say two prongs. One is each school should feel the freedom to negotiate and to push really hard on these issues on its own. And in doing so, I would say, check and see whether there's any legal basis for the charter board's position and make the argument they have no authority. And don't just make it to Naomi and staff. Call Nicole Streeter. She at least can look at the statute and say, yeah, you're right. And ultimately, she's going to give Scott and Naomi legal advice on what the scope of their authority is. So use the freedom you have as a negotiating tool. But to Robert's point, collective action, and Irene's point, I think there hasn't been enough of this kind of conversation for charter schools facing similar issues to take a unified position and just say no. It's very hard for an individual charter school under enormous pressure to say no. To say, no, we're not going to adopt the PMF. But if charter schools take a sort of a common position and let it be known, I think it empowers everybody. But that requires talking, coordinating, and making a clear position known to the charter board. And I think if you do that, it has an impact. The third thing I would say is charter board policies. I'm struggling for all the 47, 48 policies. There's surprisingly little comment by charter schools. So when the charter board is proposing a new policy, take the opportunity to weigh in on this. And even better, if you can get a set of comments that all of you or many of you will sign on to, it will have great power. And I've certainly found when you do comment and criticize proposed policies, the charter board will look at it and think about it. And you can actually trigger some reaction that might actually narrow the policy in a way that's going to be helpful.
We have a question or comment over here.
Sorry, Jonathan Weinstein, I'm with Capital City School. I've only been here for about an hour, but without being inside focused for 15 years, I have been following the debate. I'm curious, again, given the limited time I was here today, I've heard a lot of how we should all say no and the things that we should say no to. Are there examples of where we have proactively said, here's what we agree to say yes to, and let's work together to arrive at a common understanding that is an effort to bridge a gap, not just to say no. I understand the value of saying no, but I'm
the
not
answer is
sure
yes.
what the examples are and how they apply to any of the discussion today.
Right. I don't know if you were able to hear the question remotely, but the question is, are there any examples of where the charter schools, instead of just saying no, have worked together to bridge the gap between what the government or the PCSB wanted and what the charter schools felt was right? And the answer is yes. And this has been done as an entire movement and also by groups of schools. So let me give you an example on the latter. When new graduation requirements were proposed by OSSI and the State Board of Ed, Thurgood Marshall and E.L. Haynes and KIPP and 2 or 3 other schools formed a group to take these on because they were perceived to be very bad for their programs where they have a lot of AP classes and other advanced courses. And they met regularly to discuss this. We were brought in, just to basically to review what they were thinking and all that stuff and try to provide a legal perspective. And they worked with both PCSB and the State Board of Ed or OSSI on this, and they got significant changes made. So remember what I said earlier, if a proposal is coming down from the DC government, you're very likely to be able to get the PCSB on your side. And so, whether it's a group of schools or the whole, the whole crowd of schools, that really helps you if you get the PCSB. So that's one example. The other example is, I don't know if all of you know this, but the original version of the PMF that came out was far worse than what they have now, or at least worse in different ways, because it wasn't even reliable or had a lot of other technical problems. So Naomi DeVoe was my deputy at that point. And it's kind of interesting, really, because she was just outraged by the academic side of the PMF. And I was outraged, obviously, by the interference in charter school autonomy, because it involved, there had just been a huge increase in reporting and all kinds of stuff. So we did a 92-page PowerPoint and went around and showed it to all the board members individually. And turned out that they were all, in their own individual ways, upset with something about the PMF. And then I went to Ramona Edelin, the head of the association, and she, we worked together on a letter that all the schools signed on this. And then we also got the PCSB and some of their board members to a big meeting, and the room was just filled up with schools from all three. Well, they weren't tiered then, but they're schools that are now in all three tiers were there. And the PCSB, and so we didn't have the information on what the PMF was going to be until 3 weeks before it was supposed to be released. And they had all of their whole press conference schedule. They were going around the whole city and all that kind of stuff. And, I went to Brian Jones. I said, look, Brian, I hate to do this, but if you go ahead with this, then we're going to be at every one of these public meetings saying that it ain't so. And it's going to create a huge problem. So they agreed to meet with the schools, and the schools, when they heard directly from the schools that how terrible this whole thing was, they voted unanimously to put it off, and they redid the whole thing, and they changed all their staff and the whole thing. So the answer is yes. It's very hard to organize. It takes a huge amount of time. And also, sadly, we've had trouble in the past organizing charter schools to do anything that doesn't involve their pocketbook. When Fenty tried to cut the facilities allowance several years ago, we must have had 200 people in the hearing room. But when things come up that involve bills that interfere with your autonomy, it's hard for us to get 5 people. So, we're more than happy to organize the schools or to facilitate it when schools organize themselves about this stuff. But, the schools themselves are going to have to make a commitment to really stand up. And the more of you that stand up, the less fear there is that you're going to get picked off individually. And another thing is, a lot of this falls on the tier 1 schools, because the more the tier 1 schools push back, the more likely things are to change, and the less likely there are to be any repercussions, because who's going to not renew KIPP's charter, right? So, but some of the tier 1 schools, and I'm not criticizing, I'm just stating the facts. Some of the tier 1 schools and many of the other schools are, they're different responses. Some schools just believe in keeping their heads down and just doing, is it easier just to give them both the reports, as you said? And I know one tier 1 school leader who is very much like that. She wants to be under the radar as much as possible. And yet I know how she actually feels about these things. She hates them. And then we have other tier 1 schools and other schools that just push back really hard for their own, for their own interests, which is totally fine. But how much better if the rest of you did it? Because the PCSB is not willing to make changes just for one school. So like Irene said, they push back on something they didn't win. But if there are 30 schools or 50 schools complaining about it, they're going to have to do something. They just can't stand up. And a lot of people are really down on the PCSB, and I don't blame you at all. But my experience of working with them one-on-one or one-on-two is that they get very uncomfortable when a significant number of schools don't like what they're doing. They want to be liked. Whereas, the council members, they couldn't care less. But these guys want to be liked, and so they're going to do whatever they think they can to change things in response. But I think we've been spending a lot of time talking about the PCSB, and I think we should have another meeting. I know how much you all like meetings, but I think we should have another meeting to talk about specific strategies to employ when it comes to the PCSB and when it comes to OSSI and on council legislation, because I think we really need to be on the same page. And I've been telling people for years that, I know some of you rely on focus to do this stuff, and you should rely on us to do a lot of this stuff, but we can't fix everything by ourselves. It's just impossible.
Robert, would it help you out if you went to each school and said, would you please identify one person who's
No, that
gonna
would
be
kill
my
me
focus?
if I had to go to each school and do
I
that.
mean, but try and get
I would have to do
somebody, get one point person at each school who's gonna pay attention to you and who's gonna, so you know that what you're sending out there is gonna be heard.
Well, the school leaders pay attention to me,
Right.
and I'm very appreciative of that. So,
Right.
if you
So you
compare the
really are.
turnout to this meeting to the previous in the session, it's a much bigger turnout. And I'm the one who requested that people come. And school leaders, if I call them on the phone, so far they all take my calls. So yeah, but I think we need to. I think it's important that we develop. I hate to use the word system, but at least schemes for dealing with these things that don't involve, how a school leader feels about me or whatever it is. Because I'm not going to be doing this that much longer. So that's what I think we need follow up on, and we can do it through the coalition. I can bring Ramon in on this, and we can start doing that. We'll come up with a set of, maybe we should come up with a set of standards or ideals and the strategies for implementing them. And then at the most basic level, and then why doesn't everyone get out of here? I'm not confident that the leaders of every school or even the majority of the schools actually read what I send out. And I led a 1,200 student high school, public high school, so I know how bad your time is. It's horrible. I mean, it's just like the most horrible job in history. But if you're not getting, this stuff can get life and death. I mean, you want to expand your school, you have 2,000 people on your waiting list, you're not going to be able to. You're going to have to, you have to pay attention. That's the first thing, and everything else flows from that. All right, any other comments? Well, we have one other thing.
Mr. Hens.
Where do charter school boards play a role in these strategies? Is this the responsibility of the board, school head, or both, to either say no to the PCSB or to work with them? I would say both. I mean, we invited. Do we have any board members in the audience? Because we have a list of about 600, I think, board members, and we announced this program to them too. I think your board can help you a lot. I mean, the PCSB is really supposed to be interacting with the school corporation, not the school. I mean, if you read the crap that the PCSB sends out, they say they expect a day-to-day, cooperative or day-to-day close relationship with each of the charter schools. Well, this is a crock. Nobody ever wanted the PCSB to have any relationship with you except to monitor in accordance with the law. And when there is a problem, they should be, in many cases, depending on the kind of problem, they should be dealing with the chair of the board. And then, so I would say that it's vital that the leaders involve their boards to the extent it will help, and they certainly should keep their boards informed. And also, if anyone wants, we're more than happy to come out to a board meeting. We've done this before, and talk to your board about the importance of paying attention to what's going on in the politics.
Can I just add, also, don't forget that it's extremely important to use your boards in fights with the council. Because often enough, board members may be integral to neighborhoods and communities, and they may have a relationship with that board, with that council member. Yeah,
Mr. Hentz.
Robert, I hope you take this in the manner that it's given, because it's positive. I would like.
I take all positive comments.
I would like you not to adopt a conversation about quote unquote tier 1 schools, as if the rest of the schools don't exist. I think what that does is further bifurcates the movement. It has a tendency to push people aside. What you are in fact doing is saying that parental choice is not important, and that your tiering mechanism is more important than parents having the opportunity to put their children where they want to put their children. That's what school choice is about. School choice is about providing parents with choices. It's not about providing the government with choices, but parents. And if parents choose to put their school and their children in a performing arts school, that's their business.
Donald Hentz makes a good comment. I think we'll close on that we really shouldn't be talking about tier 1 schools as a separate element, because it's really not about the tiering system, and it further separates the schools from each other. And the whole charter school movement is really about school choice, which I think we all agree with. Just let me say, Donald, that my comment was more that I've been, in some cases, a little disappointed with the schools that, have the clout with the public charter school board that could help the whole movement. That we don't always effectively organize those schools with the other schools, so it isn't just. It doesn't just appear that those schools are only interested in their own, what goes on with them. And I know they're not, but it can appear that way. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope that when we do the next phase of this, which I think we badly need, that you will also participate, or someone else from your school. And as always, anyone can feel free to contact me or Michael Musante if you have you're having problems with anyone or have questions or further comments to make. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Is that evaluation on that required?
Stephen Marcus.
I really honestly believe that.
I'll send you, yeah, do you have a card?
Mr. Hentz, how are you, sir?
Oh, yeah, I'll send you the statute, and
I'm good.
I'll give you the key provisions.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you for making this work. Can I say with this, I agree with the need?
Yes, this is a sheet.
Yeah, happy to. We should do a separate session on the strategy, Robert.
We need to do that.
Do a separate session on the strategy.
Yeah.
And then she said, thanks so much.
She's at Eagle.
Mhm.